my husband and I were happy once. When I started my first job at Unico Tech Company after college, Greg was already manager there. Young, but intelligent and passionate. We worked in different sectors, so our paths didn't cross until the next Christmas party, where he swept me off my feet with his charm. My mother warned me about men like him. He was too good looking, too confident, too perfect. He was so perfect, in fact, that I missed all the warning signs until much later. A romance quickly bloomed between us, and we tied the knot the following year. We opted for a winter wedding to reflect on how we first met. Our wedding ceremony itself was beautiful and serene, while the reception after party was the exact opposite. I guess that's our own fault for offering an open bar, though. Throughout the evening, my husband continued to drink, and his behavior became increasingly aggressive and indecent. While we had talked about his drinking problem before, it was on the list of things he had promised to fix in our marriage. Naively, I believed him. I turned a blind eye to that side of him and enjoyed the evening, accepting my life as the new Mrs. Gregg. The next 2 weeks of our honeymoon were spent on a cruise around the Mediterranean, enjoying the sights, sea, and bars deliciously. Afterward, our lives slowly went back to the normal routine, and we tried not to let our personal lives affect our work. I was offered redundancy sometime later with a generous severance package due to financial cuts to our department. I felt a bit of grudge towards them, though I didn't hold it against my husband, who continued to work for them. What I did find strange, however, was that he hired a personal secretary soon after, despite the supposed tightness to their budget. A few months passed quietly as I focused on home life without much worry about employment, since my husband brought home a decent salary to keep us stable. While he seemed supportive of my decision initially, he had also been growing increasingly distant and cold to me since I started staying home more. The first time I asked him about it was the first time he snapped at me. He got very vocally aggressive and demeaning, seemingly out of the blue. And though he apologized to me about it later, our relationship never recovered from that point. In fact, it continued to spiral as we grew further apart. By our first anniversary, I no longer recognized the man I had married. The sweet man I loved had been transformed into a temperamental and psychotic man-child. I had heard similar stories of this from friends who had been married longer than me, their man losing interest or, in some cases, abusing their partner for no reason. I counted it as a small bit of luck that Greg had so far never been physically violent with me, though with his horrible temper, I never felt the idea was far from his mind. What started as the occasional nag about dirty dishes or the housework left undone, over time turned personal when he focused on my weight, berating me for, in his words, putting on a few pounds, which I was disgusted by, but did not object to, as I found out very quickly that arguing with him only made him more malicious. In the evenings when he wasn't working late or at a bar with his friends, I felt like I was always on thin ice. One misstep or wrong word may trigger another abusive episode. He made me feel like shit. He knew he did, but he didn't care. Hell, he might have even enjoyed it. Being a housewife was now more reminiscent of a prison sentence, with Greg as my sadistic, watchful jailer. The newest level of low that he dropped to was a constant reminder that he could do so much better than settling for me, each time pointing instead to his beautiful new secretary, Jenny. He would talk about his secretary constantly, and though it made me sick to compare us, I never knew how serious his threat was. Part of me wanted to see what he would do, like it was ripping off a band-aid. Let him go if he really wanted to. Then, things somehow managed to get even worse. It was the night of the annual company party, an event I lavishly enjoyed in previous years. It was a bonus that I looked forward to, catching up with old colleagues too. Greg, on the other hand, had other plans. He waited until after I spent an hour getting myself dressed up to tell me that I wasn't allowed to go. While I expected this was just another grudge or tantrum instead, he said that he never told his company he was bringing a guest. I fell onto the sofa in disbelief. He left as the tears began to flow down my cheeks. I sat in my pajamas, eating ice cream the rest of the night, trying to eat away my pain. By 1 a.m., I gave up waiting for him to return and went to bed, only to be disturbed shortly after by sounds of the door closing downstairs. When I went downstairs to check, I found Greg, stumbling in the hallway, failing miserably to remove his shoes. I tried to sneak away, but to no success. He gave up on his shoes and followed me into the landing. His words were gibberish, and the stench of alcohol was thick on his breath. Without invitation, permission, or hesitation, I felt his hands all over me, grabbing indecently. I told him no, but he carried on, holding me tighter. After finally hitting my limit, I pushed him away, causing him to lose his footing and fall into the wall behind us. I didn't wait for him to collect himself, and ran towards the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. The door had no lock. He wouldn't allow me to install any locks in the house, even in the bathroom. But I knew I had to do something to keep him out. I began to slide the wardrobe over. It was slow to budge, but it did enough to stop him barging in moments later. He hounded the door countless times, bashing it over and over as he yelled in rage. He yelled about what a bitch I was and what he would do when he got his hands on me. When his rage began to simmer, his mind wandered to thoughts on his beloved secretary again. He remarked tonight was the last straw in a long line of disappointments I had caused myself. The room fell silent after 10 minutes, and I heard footsteps retreat down the stairs. I slept with one eye open that night, hoping his memories of tonight would disappear with his hangover. He was still asleep on the sofa when I got up the next morning, moving the furniture I'd used to barricade the bedroom as a last-ditch defense. Carefully, I tiptoed around downstairs towards him, but unluckily fell onto a squeaky floorboard. I tensed up, pausing mid-crouch as I waited to hear whether I had been found out. In this unsure moment, I even stopped breathing in case it made too much noise. After the snoring continued, I breathed a sigh of relief and relaxed, failing to notice the keys he had dropped as I went into the kitchen. Crunch. Metal jangled under my bare feet as hot pain shot up my leg. I yelped instinctively before catching myself. Muffled grunts came from the sofa as he started to stir. I quickly gathered my things, ignoring his attempts to call after me. He was charging down the hallway when I threw open the front door. I ran, fumbling with my car keys as I watched the empty doorway closely. I didn't wait for him to appear and chase. I drove off quickly, nearly crashing into an angry cyclist in the process. For a while, without a destination, I just wanted to be away from him, as far as I could be. I thought about visiting my mom, but I knew that would be the first place Greg would look for me. I hated the idea of what he would do if he caught me while still in one of his moods. After an hour of circling the same streets, I parked up somewhere downtown and entered a bar. Despite being before noon, there was still a row of loyal alcoholics firmly parked on their bar stools, tempting me into the idea with little else to do. I didn't have much cash on me. Greg had been controlling what I could carry for a while now. I suppose he thought it would make me rely on him more, or that I couldn't run away. A few hours and a few cheap cocktails later, I was rudely disturbed by a hand on my shoulder. In my intoxication-fueled paranoia, I shrugged it off and jumped to my feet. Instead, staring back, mildly confused and concerned, was Steve, a friend of Greg's. While Greg socialized often, I never knew how much of his real behavior leaked out. Did his friends know about the abuse and who he really was? The question left me skeptical and defensive as he tried to calm me down. Steve explained that Greg rang him, worried, and asked for help to find me, though he said that I was the one acting strange. When he offered to call Greg to reassure him, I was hit by panic mode again, and was already preparing to leave. I would have got away if not for Steve, who settled my nerves. I sat down again and told him everything. I didn't know if he would believe me, but I needed to say it. After I started, I found out I was unable to hold back anymore, releasing all my bottled-up feelings. As he listened, he gave nothing away, a solid poker face retained throughout my speech that left me feeling a little uneasy and unpredictable. When I finished, he sat fidgeting for a few minutes with his eyes firmly locked on his phone on the table. Then, as if by magic or willpower, the phone began to ring as Greg was calling him, and at the worst possible moment. I felt my face go pale. When he noticed it, he moved his hand toward it. I begged him to stop, but he didn't. Instead, he pressed decline and ended the call. I sat still as he moved to hold my hand. We stayed like that for an eternally extended second. My heartbeat nearly burst through my chest as a warm, fuzzy feeling overcame me. This was real love. We stayed a while longer, just chatting. I found Steve to be the total opposite of Greg. He was kind, thoughtful, and funny, all the qualities I thought I saw in my husband at the start. I even caught myself laughing a few times at Steve's jokes, momentarily forgetting how miserable life was with Greg. It came as a surprise after having gone so long in my life without hearing my own laugh. Time flew by, and it was only at closing time did we realize how long we'd spent in each other's company. The thought of returning home to that monster only restarted my anxiety and dread, and thoughts of punishments that awaited for me there. Steve promised to make up a good excuse to get me out of trouble, ringing Greg to say that he was bringing me back now. When questioned about me, Steve only said that he bumped into me in the early afternoon when I was out on errands, and he insisted I take him along to finish them before we go back. This left Steve with the brunt of the blame, though I didn't expect Greg to hold a grudge against his best friend. When Steve dropped me home, he left me in Greg's hands. I did and acted exactly as Greg expected of me. He didn't apologize or mention his behavior the night before, so I didn't ask or remind him. As if by some arrangement or miracle, Steve happened to visit more often after that fateful day. Of course, he said it was always to see Greg about work or football, but secretly, I knew he did it to check up on me. We managed to chat sometimes when Greg wasn't around, but the only times we could talk safely was in person. Greg had swiped my cell phone in the past to look at my messages when he thought I'd been cheating on him. That's why we couldn't plan my escape now. I had to wait patiently for my best chance. A month later, I got a call from Greg in the afternoon, telling me that he was going on a trip for work tonight and wouldn't be back for a few days. Though in no way was his tone caring or considerate, it was a fact, in order and nothing more. I quickly packed my things and rang Steve, explaining the situation. 10 minutes later, his car was parked outside to aid my escape. I left a small note on the fridge for Greg, telling him not to look for me, though he had never listened to me before. For my second escape, Steve and I had made a plan during our long chat at the bar. Staying with friends or family would be too obvious for now. When he saw that I was scared to go through with the plan, he volunteered to check us in at a motel. Not only that, he also stayed with me, which eased my worries as well. Knowing Greg would be away for a few days made me relax a little, but when we went back to the house once more to collect more of my things, I paused. I had gotten this far only to be stopped in our tracks when we noticed Greg's car parked outside. It was too late to back out now. Update 1. Steve and I spent the next few days in the motel. We lived like vampires, or hardly fugitives, making sure to avoid any chance we might be spotted. In the moments of my worst paranoia, I tried to convince Steve to change motels, though he assured me we were safe here. While I never planned to go outside anytime soon, this changed when I got a call from my mother. She asked me to stop and come over immediately. She also sounded scared. When I tried to explain, I couldn't. She got very insistent on it, also asked about my location. Her behavior and words were completely alien to me, like she was reading from a script. It suddenly hit me why the call was weird. It reminded me of a film I'd seen recently on daytime TV, of a kidnap. A film where the hostage was forced to ring the home for their own ransom. My bastard husband had her. Knowing this, I forgot the danger I felt before, and Steve rushed me over to her rescue. The front door was open as we arrived, and we found them sitting in silence at the kitchen table. My mother was shaking uncontrollably and appeared injured, no doubt at Greg's hand that sat across from her and stared with cold malice. I asked Greg to hang back, quite sure that he would only go berserk when he saw Steve, and connected in his mind. I moved to comfort my mother, but Greg intercepted me, striking me to the floor without a word. As I began to stand, I felt a sharp blow to my ribs as Greg kicked me over. I looked up and saw his fury as he stood over me. The beating was not going to stop this time. As he raised his fist, Steve burst into the room and grabbed him, giving me time to collect myself as the two wrestled for control. When I managed to stand and shake off the dizziness, Greg was sitting atop Steve and choking him. Without thinking, I swiped a nearby flower vase, apologizing briefly to my mother. I then brought it down onto Greg's head, breaking it into a shower of thick glass. Greg slumped to the floor, releasing his grip on Steve, who now coughed and wheezed. With the fight seemingly over, I helped Steve up before taking them both to sit down on the sofa. I thought they may calm down easier in a different room. When I returned to the kitchen a few moments later to look for a first aid kit, Greg had vanished. From the open doorway, I could faintly hear his car zooming away down the street. It was hard to relax after it happened, but it at least felt like a small victory after many, many personal defeats. Update 2. Steve and I stayed at my mother's house that night. We were unsure whether Greg would return after we managed to fend him off together, but I hoped our presence would at least deter him from seeking revenge on my mother after we left. We were all a little bruised and shaken after Greg left no one more so than my mother, who sported a number of discolored bruises. I was ready to call the cops as soon as he left, but the kind soul that my mother was didn't want them to get involved. My mother was a devout Christian to a fault, always believing in forgiveness when it wasn't deserved, even when faced with the devil. Steve put down the frozen peas, cooling his busted lip, and joined the debate. While he favored revenge, he agreed cops wouldn't keep Greg away. It would only harm us as much as Steve did due to the injuries we gave him as well, not to mention the legal fees. Steve did, however, come up with another good idea. If we couldn't send him to jail, the least we could do was get him fired from the company he loved. Steve admitted that as long as he had been Greg's best friend, he'd always noticed a sleazy behavior from him. This behavior was especially noticeable in the way he treated women and subordinates in the office. Therefore, if we filed a sexual harassment claim against him, even anonymously, the upper management would have no choice but to investigate it. Steve was grimly sure that once they started to look into him, there'd be a lot of dirt on him over his years of employment. Finding the number for their HR manager, I elected to make the call. It wasn't likely that they would recognize Steve by voice, but it was my claim to make, my nightmare, my life. The call was relatively quick and painless. I omitted a number of personal details to keep it vague, but the nice lady assured me they would look into the matter. They were also very sure that no consequences would be brought back to me because of this. I felt like celebrating. For the second time in months, I'd been heard. I wasn't an object that Greg owned, but a real person again. And now, with my revenge fully in motion, I could only hope they would bring the hammer down on him soon, before he made his next move. Update 3. The next week was somewhat uneventful. Greg never returned to my mother's house, thankfully, but he had seemingly also given up trying to contact me. Greg's grab for attention had lessened with his interest in me, and now he had assumedly moved on, perhaps with that secretary of his that he'd always threatened to leave me for. Steve reported that Greg still went into the office, behavior unchanged as if nothing had happened, only with the exception of their broken friendship and deathly glares whenever they were in the same room. I didn't know if I should be relieved or insulted to make so little of an impact in his life. Despite this news, I'd begun to recover myself, feeling more like my old self again. After building up the courage to go job hunting, I managed to get some part-time work at a little coffee shop nearby. During one of my busy afternoon shifts, I ended up missing a call from Steve. Excusing myself for 5 minutes to ring back, Steve picked up immediately and gave me the good news. Greg had been called into the boss's office this morning. This was very unusual because the meeting was an unscheduled meeting, as well as the CEO and HR was present. Though no one else in the office had been briefed on the subject, they all understood the context. At some points in the conversation, shouting echoed through the plaster-thin walls, holding no secrets. It was now common knowledge that Greg was being investigated on a number of sexual harassment and assault claims. And that was just the beginning. We may have been the first domino to fall, but we would not be the last. Anonymity was thrown out the window by the number of interviews that occurred in the conference room. Upper management seemingly kept quite busy by their employees' stories. Greg's secretary, on the other hand, seemingly escaped the scrutiny by being on vacation. A valuable key witness lost in the wind. Update 4. In true bureaucratic fashion, no decision was made about Greg quickly. For a while, since this started, we thought he'd managed to talk his way out of any punishment. Steve knew he got on well with upper management after all, and maybe he could have, if it wasn't for the others. Many other employees queued up, ready to tell their own horror stories about Greg, escalating the issue into the limelight. This was not something they could ignore or sweep under the rug. About 10 days after Greg's interrogation, his secretary, Jenny, returned from her travels. Coincidentally, she was also called into the conference room with upper management to talk about Greg. Rumors of their relationship had spread through the office after I directly mentioned her name in my initial claim. This also happened to make her coincidental absence quite suspicious to some eyes, as if Greg had caringly sent her away to avoid her getting involved. But to all of our surprise, she denied everything, claiming that she too had suffered under Greg. Jenny had simply been another victim, too intimidated by him to speak out before. With no one left to back Greg up, they fired him shortly afterward, without even a thanks or well done for his many years of dutiful service. Steve first realized they'd made their decision when he spotted Greg packing his desk into cardboard boxes, looking glum and defeated for the first time since the ordeal began. If the initial claim was too early to celebrate, now was certainly the time. With life as Greg knew it ruined, he was left friendless and jobless. And good luck talking your way out of that one in your next job interview, scumbag. Life after that became actually pleasant. Steve and I began dating officially after I squeezed a divorce out of my good-for-nothing husband. While I expected some kind of pushback or argument, Greg accepted the idea over a text message, though there was little more confrontation when I argued how to split our assets. Greg, being Greg, didn't want to leave me anything, but at the threat of a long legal battle, he did eventually cave into a 50-50 split. I thought the split was more than fair, given the marriage that I had endured. With my payout, I bought a new place outside the city for Steve and me to move into. After everything that happened, I invited my mother in as well. I felt too scared and protective of her to leave her living alone. She confided that she still had nightmares about her home invasion, and being the age that she was, it was unfair to let her struggle alone when I could help her. We moved on with our lives, and Greg did the same. I could only hope his next conquest would find him more compassionate than I did.